Chapter 1. The Arrival of Shadows. The train screeched to a halt with a metallic groan, its carriages swaying slightly as the brakes fought the momentum. The station was deserted, shrouded in the heavy mist of the late evening. Rows of flickering lampposts cast feeble yellow halos onto the wet cobblestones, their light struggling to pierce through the thick fog. She stepped off the train with a small suitcase in hand, her figure almost swallowed by the dimness of the platform. Her coat clung to her frame, damp from the dew that hung in the air like an unspoken warning. Her name was Iris. She turned it over in her mind as though testing its weight, feeling its foreignness settle. It no longer felt like hers. It had been a shield, a thing to hide behind. But now, in this place, it was a whisper, a fragment of someone else. The town existed as a whisper, too. Its presence was felt rather than seen, a muted echo in the mist. The buildings beyond the station loomed faintly, their outlines blurred as if they were dissolving into the fog itself. The train behind her hissed once more and began to roll away, its fading hum swallowed by the night. Iris moved through the station, her boots echoing in the vast emptiness. A chill prickled her skin, sharp and insistent, as though the air itself carried secrets. The faint scent of salt water mingled with the tang of iron, and somewhere far off, waves crashed against rocks, rhythmic and ceaseless. She paused at the edge of the platform, staring into the abyss where the town should have been. A car waited for her outside, its headlights cutting twin beams through the gray. The driver was an older man, his face lined with years that had left his expression inscrutable. He offered no greeting, simply gesturing to the back seat. Iris hesitated for a moment before climbing in, the suitcase balanced awkwardly on her lap. The ride was steeped in silence, save for the engine's low rumble and the occasional groan of tires over uneven gravel. The road twisted and turned, winding through dense woods that seemed alive in the darkness. The trees arched overhead like guardians, their skeletal branches entwining to block out the sky. She watched them pass, each one a sentinel, each one carrying its own shadow. Her thoughts were a labyrinth, her memories folding in on themselves. What had brought her here? It wasn't a question she was ready to answer, even to herself. But she could feel it, a compulsion, an invisible thread pulling her towards something unknown. It was the kind of pull one did not resist, even if the path it carved was laced with thorns. The house came into view at last, and her breath caught. It loomed on the cliff's edge, a stark silhouette against the night sky. Its sharp angles and worn facade gave it the appearance of a thing alive, watching her with hollow eyes. Ivy clung to its walls, creeping like veins toward the eaves. The windows, black and reflective, seemed to absorb the scant light that surrounded them. The car stopped, and Iris stepped out, the wind tearing at her hair as she gathered her belongings. The driver placed her suitcase on the ground, nodded once, and disappeared into the mist without a word. The sound of his departure was swallowed almost immediately, leaving her standing alone. The sea roared below, unseen but ever-present, its voice a constant undercurrent. Iris gripped the suitcase tightly and approached the house, her footsteps crunching over the gravel path. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though something unseen pushed back against her. Inside, the house was as she imagined it, a monument to neglect. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and old wood. Sheets covered the furniture, their shapes distorted in the dim light, transforming chairs into crouching beasts and tables into crouched figures. A faint draft whispered through the hall, tugging at the edges of the sheets as if trying to uncover what lay beneath. She wandered the ground floor first, her eyes drawn to every detail. A grand staircase spiraled upward, its banister worn smooth by countless hands. A painting hung on the far wall, its subject obscured by years of grime and shadow. The floor beneath her creaked with every step, a chorus of groans that seemed to echo far beyond her presence. When she reached the second floor, she chose a room at the far end of the corridor. The door opened with a groan, revealing a modest space. A single bed was pushed against the wall, its iron frame flaking with rust. A desk sat beneath the window, and a mirror hung above it, its surface cracked in one corner. She set her suitcase down and unpacked, each movement deliberate, each object a tether to reality in a place that felt like it drifted beyond time. The window offered a view of the ocean, its waves rolling endlessly toward the cliffs. In the faint moonlight, she could see the spray rising like ghosts from the water's surface. She stood there for a long while, her fingers resting on the glass, the cold seeping into her skin. Night deepened, and the house seemed to breathe. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows in their frames, and the floorboards groaned in protest beneath its weight. Iris lay in bed, her body still but her mind restless. The walls whispered around her, the sound indistinct but insistent, like a forgotten song. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, of the life she had left behind. She had no answers, only the gnawing certainty that something awaited her in this place. And as her eyes grew heavy, she could not shake the feeling that she was not alone. The house watched her as she drifted into sleep, its shadows shifting and stretching as though reaching for her. And outside, the mist thickened, curling around the house like a living thing. Chapter 2. Beneath the Veil of Waves. Morning arrived as a pale, uncertain light that seeped through the heavy curtains of Iris's room. The wind had quieted, replaced by a lingering hush that seemed to stretch over the cliffs. She opened her eyes to a ceiling lined with faint cracks, tracing their paths like veins of some unseen heart. For a moment, she remained still, her breath shallow, as though the house demanded her silence. The air carried a faint chill, pressing against her skin as she swung her legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold beneath her feet, the wood worn smooth by countless steps before her own. She moved to the window, her fingers brushing the fabric of the curtains aside. The view that greeted her was both vast and confining. A sea stretching endlessly toward the horizon, its surface restless and gray beneath a heavy sky. The cliffs below appeared sharp and treacherous, their edges jutting into the ocean like teeth. The world outside the house felt distant, muffled by the ever-present mist. Yet, there was a pull to it, a quiet beckoning. Iris turned from the window and dressed quickly, layering herself against the chill she knew would bite more fiercely beyond the house's walls. Her boots, still dusted from the train station's platform, creaked softly as she descended the staircase. The house felt different in the daylight, though only slightly. The shadows that had clung to every corner now seemed to retreat, yet they left behind an unsettling emptiness. She moved through the rooms cautiously, her steps careful as if she might disturb the slumber of something unseen. The kitchen was a relic of another time, its appliances outdated and its surfaces worn. She found a kettle in one of the cupboards and filled it from the tap, the sound of running water breaking the oppressive silence. As the kettle boiled, she stood by the window, gazing out at the narrow path that wound its way toward the cliffs. The tea warmed her hands as she stepped outside, the mug clasped tightly between her fingers. The wind met her immediately, threading through her hair and pulling at her coat. The path ahead was uneven, its stones slick with moisture. She followed it slowly, her gaze fixed on the sea as it churned and roared below. As she walked, the weight of the house seemed to lessen, replaced by the pull of the ocean. The sound of the waves grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to drown out everything else. She stopped at the edge of the cliff, her boots just shy of the brittle earth that crumbled and fell away into the abyss. The sea stretched endlessly before her, a mirror to her own mind, tumultuous, filled with secrets she could not yet name. The wind howled, carrying with it the faintest echo of something she could not place. It wasn't a voice, not truly, but it felt alive, as though the ocean itself was calling her. Her eyes drifted to the rocks below, slick and jagged, where waves crashed and shattered into white foam. There, among the shadows of the water, something gleamed, a fleeting glint of light, like the sun catching a shard of glass. She leaned forward instinctively, her breath catching as she tried to discern what it was. But the moment passed, the light disappearing into the depths as quickly as it had appeared. Iris lingered at the edge, her thoughts unraveling in the rhythm of the waves. The ocean felt alive, its presence both a comfort and a threat. It reminded her of why she had come, though she could not yet articulate it. There was something about this place, this house, this sea, that felt inevitable, as though it had been waiting for her arrival. When she turned back toward the house, the mist had thickened, curling around her like a living thing. The path that had been clear minutes ago was now obscured, the stones beneath her feet barely visible. She moved carefully, her steps slow as the fog swallowed the landscape. The house emerged from the haze gradually, its silhouette stark and unyielding. Inside, the stillness returned, wrapping around her like a familiar cloak. She set the empty mug on the counter and wandered through the rooms, her fingers trailing lightly over the surfaces. Each object she touched seemed to hum with its own quiet energy, as though the house itself breathed life into them. In the study, she paused before a shelf lined with books, their spines faded and their titles barely legible. One in particular caught her eye, its leather cover worn and cracked. She opened it carefully, the pages yellowed and brittle. The writing inside was dense and archaic, the kind that required more effort to read than she could summon at that moment. But tucked between the pages was a photograph, its edges frayed. The image was black and white, depicting the house in its prime. A group of people stood on the front steps, their expressions captured in that timeless stillness unique to old photographs. She studied their faces, searching for something she could not name. A man in the center of the group drew her attention. His gaze was piercing, even through the faded photograph, as though he could see her through the years. A shiver ran through her as she replaced the photo and closed the book. The study felt colder now, the air heavy with something she couldn't define. She returned to the main room, her steps quickened by an inexplicable urge to leave the space behind. The day wore on slowly, the hours marked only by the shifting light through the windows. As evening approached, the wind returned, rattling the house as though trying to shake it from its foundation. Iris sat by the window in her room, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sea met the sky. The fog rolled in thicker than before, swallowing the cliffs entirely. When night fell, she lay in bed once more, her body heavy with exhaustion but her mind restless. The house creaked around her, the sounds blending with the wind and the distant crash of waves. She thought of the photograph, of the man with the piercing gaze, and wondered what stories this place held. Sleep came slowly, and as her eyes closed, the house seemed to shift around her, its presence pressing closer. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, something stirred. Chapter 3: Threads of an Unknown Bond. The first tendrils of dawn stretched across the sky, brushing the horizon with muted shades of pink and gray. Iris awoke to the sound of the ocean, its rhythmic roar filling the silence of the house. Her dreams had been restless, fragmented images that scattered the moment her eyes opened, leaving behind only a vague sense of unease. She sat up slowly, her body heavy with the kind of fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. The room was cold, the thin morning light filtering through the cracked window pane. She dressed with practiced efficiency, layering herself against the chill that seemed to cling to every surface of the house. Downstairs, The kitchen greeted her with its usual stillness. The kettle hissed faintly on the stove, its soft whistle rising as steam curled into the air. Iris cradled a mug of tea in her hands, letting its warmth seep into her skin as she stood by the window. Outside, the mist hung low, blanketing the cliffs and sea in an opaque shroud. The house, despite its emptiness, felt alive. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind against the walls seemed deliberate, as if the building itself was breathing. Iris had always been attuned to such subtleties, a sensitivity that had both helped and haunted her throughout her life. She decided to explore. The idea came to her suddenly, like a whisper carried on the wind. There was something about this place that demanded understanding, a puzzle waiting to be solved. Iris wrapped a scarf around her neck and pulled on her coat, the weight of it grounding her as she stepped into the hallway. The house stretched out before her like a labyrinth, its corridors long and shadowed. She started with the ground floor, moving through each room with quiet deliberation. The dining room was dominated by a massive table, its surface scarred by years of use. A chandelier hung above it, its crystals dulled by a thick layer of dust. The chairs, carved with intricate patterns, stood like sentinels around the table, their shadows stretching across the floor. The study was as she had left it, the bookshelves looming like forgotten monuments. She avoided the book with the photograph, though the memory of it lingered at the edges of her thoughts. Instead, her fingers traced the spines of other volumes, their titles obscured by age. She pulled one from the shelf at random, its pages crumbling slightly as she opened it. The text was handwritten, a journal perhaps, though the entries were fragmented and cryptic. The tide grows stronger each night, whispers in the wind, cannot stay much longer. The words trailed off into illegible scrawls, their meaning just out of reach. Iris replaced the journal carefully, her pulse quickening. She moved to the upper floor next, her footsteps slow and deliberate on the creaking staircase. The air grew colder as she ascended, each step accompanied by the faint echo of her own movements. The hallway stretched out before her, its walls lined with faded wallpaper that peeled at the edges. One door at the far end of the corridor drew her attention. It was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. Iris hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob before she pushed it open. The room was small, barely more than a closet, but its contents were striking. A collection of objects lay scattered across the floor. An old gramophone, its horn dented and tarnished. A child's wooden toy, its paint chipped and faded. And a box filled with photographs, their edges curled with age. Iris knelt by the box, her fingers trembling slightly as she lifted the first photograph. The image showed a young woman standing on the cliffs, her face turned away from the camera. The next photograph depicted the house, its facade pristine and untouched by time. The final photograph made Iris's breath catch. It was a close-up of a hand, reaching toward the camera. The hand was slender, delicate, and unmistakably hers. She dropped the photograph as though it had burned her, the image fluttering to the floor. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at the photo, its edges curling slightly on the worn wood. How could it exist? The sound of a door slamming below startled her, breaking the stillness like a crack of thunder. She rose quickly, her heart pounding as she moved to the hallway. The house was silent once more, but the echo of the slam lingered, reverberating through her bones. She descended the stairs cautiously, her hand brushing the banister as though it might anchor her. The front door was closed, the bolt still in place. She checked the other rooms, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner where the light faltered. Nothing. The silence grew oppressive, wrapping around her like a shroud. She returned to the kitchen, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. The house felt different now, its presence heavier, more insistent. Outside, the mist pressed against the windows, a living, breathing thing that seemed to watch her. Iris couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone, that the house itself was aware of her movements, her thoughts, her fears. As the day waned, she retreated to her room, her mind a whirlwind of questions. The photograph haunted her, its impossible presence a weight she could not ignore. She stared at the sea through the window, its waves rolling endlessly toward the cliffs. Night fell slowly, the darkness creeping in like a tide. The house groaned around her, its walls shifting as though alive. Iris lay in bed, her body still but her mind restless. The photograph remained in the box upstairs, but its image lingered in her thoughts, a thread pulling at the edges of her understanding. And somewhere, deep within the house, a faint sound echoed. It was a whisper. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Twilight. The fog thickened overnight, blanketing the cliffs in an opaque shroud that seemed to muffle even the roar of the sea. Iris woke to a peculiar stillness, her breath visible in the cold morning air. Her dreams had been vivid and unsettling, filled with shadowy figures and the sound of crashing waves. But as with most dreams, the details had slipped through her fingers upon waking. She sat up slowly, her body heavy with a lethargy she couldn't quite shake. Outside, the faint light of dawn barely pierced the mist, creating an eerie glow that seeped through the cracks in the curtains. Iris wrapped herself in a heavy sweater, her fingers brushing the knit fabric as though grounding herself to the tangible. Descending the stairs, she noticed the air in the house was heavier than the day before, as though the fog outside had seeped into the very walls. The faint scent of salt lingered, mixing with the mustiness of old wood and dust. Each step she took echoed faintly, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the silence that enveloped the house. In the kitchen, the kettle took longer to boil, or at least it felt that way. Iris leaned against the counter, her fingers tapping an absent rhythm against the surface as she stared out the window. The sea was invisible now, hidden beneath the veil of mist, but she could hear it, a rhythmic pulse that felt like the heartbeat of the world around her. After tea, she decided to step outside. The thought came unbidden, a pull she couldn't ignore. Wrapping her scarf tightly around her neck, she stepped onto the gravel path. The fog was cold and damp, clinging to her skin as she moved. The house loomed behind her, its edges blurred, as though it might dissolve into the mist if she ventured too far. She followed the path toward the cliffs, her boots crunching softly against the stones. The air was thick, each breath a weight in her lungs. As she walked, a sense of unease settled over her, growing with each step. The world around her felt different, unfamiliar, as though she had crossed some invisible threshold into a place that existed only in fragments of forgotten memory. At the edge of the cliff, she stopped. The mist swirled around her, hiding the sea below but amplifying its sound. The waves crashed against the rocks, their rhythm hypnotic and unyielding. Iris stared into the gray expanse, her eyes searching for something she couldn't name. Then, faintly, she heard it. A sound carried on the wind, soft and fleeting, like the faintest murmur of a voice. It was indistinct, blending with the roar of the waves, but it was there, a presence in the fog. Iris's breath hitched, her body tensing as she strained to hear more. The sound came again, this time more distinct. A single word, though its meaning escaped her. It was as though the mist itself had spoken, its voice a part of the air she breathed. She stepped closer to the edge, her pulse quickening as she tried to pinpoint the source. The earth beneath her feet felt unsteady, loose gravel shifting with each step. She froze as the sound came a third time, clearer now, a whisper that brushed against her ear like a lover's breath. It wasn't a word she recognized, but it filled her with a strange sense of longing, a pull so strong it made her knees weaken. Iris stumbled back, her chest heaving as she tried to steady herself. The mist seemed to press closer, its tendrils curling around her like fingers. She turned and hurried back toward the house, her steps quick and uneven. Inside, the air felt warmer, safer, though the unease lingered. Iris leaned against the door, her hands trembling as she tried to collect her thoughts. The sound had been real, she was certain of it. But what it was, or where it had come from, she could not say. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Iris moved through the house as though in a trance, her mind circling back to the whisper she had heard. She returned to the small room upstairs, the one filled with scattered objects and the box of photographs. The photographs lay untouched, their images as haunting as before. She avoided the one of the hand, but her fingers brushed another image, this one of a shoreline, the cliffs rising sharply against the backdrop of a stormy sky. Beneath the photographs, she found something new. A folded piece of paper, its edges yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, her breath catching as she read the words scrawled across the page in an elegant hand. The tide carries what the land cannot hold. The sea remembers what we forget. The words were cryptic, yet they resonated with her, a strange sense of familiarity threading through her thoughts. She read them again, trying to discern their meaning, but the letters seemed to blur, the ink shifting before her eyes. She set the paper down and turned away, her chest tight with a feeling she couldn't name. Night fell quickly, the darkness pressing against the windows as the wind returned. The house groaned under its weight, the sound blending with the distant crash of the waves. Iris lay in bed, her body heavy with exhaustion but her mind restless. She thought of the whisper, of the strange words on the paper, of the photograph of the hand that had unsettled her so deeply. The threads of these mysteries tangled in her mind, pulling her deeper into the house's grasp. As sleep finally claimed her, the fog outside thickened, pressing against the house like a living thing. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, the whisper came again, softer this time, but no less insistent. Chapter 5. A Heart Lost in Fog. The morning arrived not with light, but with an unrelenting grayness that seeped into every corner of the house. Iris awoke to the sound of rain, a steady patter against the windows that echoed faintly in the silence. Her dreams had been darker this time, a tangle of fragmented images that left her with a lingering unease. As she rose from bed, she noticed how the air in the room seemed heavier, saturated with the scent of salt and damp earth. The mist outside had thickened, wrapping the house in an impenetrable cocoon. Even the sea, whose roar had been a constant companion, seemed muted, its voice swallowed by the fog. Iris dressed quickly, her movements brisk as though trying to outrun the unease that clung to her. Downstairs, the kitchen felt colder than usual, the walls seeming to close in around her as she prepared her tea. She stood by the window as it steeped, her gaze fixed on the blurred landscape outside. The rain blurred the world beyond the glass, streaking the view until it was nothing but smudges of gray and green. Yet, within the haze, something shifted. A flicker of movement near the edge of the cliffs caught her eye, a shadow that seemed to melt into the mist before she could make sense of it. Her fingers tightened around the mug as her heart quickened. The rational part of her mind dismissed it as a trick of the light, a distortion caused by the rain and fog. But another part of her, a deeper, instinctual part, whispered otherwise. She shook off the thought and turned her attention back to the house. There was still so much of it unexplored, each room a potential piece of the puzzle she was trying to solve. The cryptic note she had found the day before lingered in her mind, its words looping endlessly. The tide carries what the land cannot hold. The sea remembers what we forget. What did it mean? Who had written it, and why? She moved through the house with renewed purpose, her footsteps soft against the worn wooden floors. The library was her first destination, its towering shelves offering a potential wealth of information. She lit a lamp against the gloom and began her search, running her fingers along the spines of the books. Most were old, their pages yellowed and brittle, but a few stood out, books that seemed newer, their covers unmarked by time. One in particular caught her attention, its title embossed in gold on the spine, Tides and Memories, the Unseen Connection. She pulled it from the shelf and carried it to a nearby desk. The book opened with a faint creak, its pages stiff from disuse. Inside, she found a collection of essays, each one exploring the mysterious pull of the ocean and its connection to memory, both personal and collective. One passage struck her deeply. Water is the keeper of time, holding within its depths the echoes of all that has been. The sea, eternal and vast, remembers what we choose to forget. It whispers to those who listen, revealing fragments of the past to those willing to hear. Iris read the passage twice, her mind racing. The words seemed to resonate with her, their meaning both clear and elusive. Was the sea truly alive, a keeper of forgotten truths? And if so, what was it trying to tell her? The sound of a distant creak broke her concentration. She looked up sharply, her heart pounding as she listened. The house was still, the silence pressing against her like a physical weight. But she could have sworn she had heard something, movement, faint but distinct, coming from the hallway. She rose slowly, the book still clutched in her hands, and moved toward the door. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by the faint light filtering through the windows. She stepped into it cautiously, her breath shallow as she strained to hear. The sound came again, a soft shuffle, like fabric brushing against wood. It seemed to come from the direction of the staircase, but when she turned, there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, the air still and heavy. Iris's grip on the book tightened as she moved toward the stairs. She descended slowly, each step deliberate, her senses alert. The lower floor was darker, the rain outside casting strange shadows through the windows. In the front room, she stopped abruptly. The door, which she was certain she had bolted the night before, was slightly ajar. A faint draft seeped through the opening, carrying with it the scent of rain and earth. Her pulse quickened as she stepped closer, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of intrusion. But there was nothing, no footprints on the damp floor, no sign that anyone had entered. She pushed the door closed and slid the bolt into place, her hands trembling. The rest of the house was silent, but the unease lingered, a constant presence that she couldn't shake. She returned to the library, the book still in her hands, and sank into a chair. The words on the page blurred as her thoughts raced. What was happening here? The whisper at the cliffs, the cryptic note, the unbolted door. Each piece seemed connected, though she couldn't yet see how. And then there was the photograph of the hand, a detail she had tried to push from her mind but could no longer ignore. The rain continued into the evening, its rhythm steady and relentless. Iris stayed in the library, the lamp casting a warm glow that felt like a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. She read and reread passages from the book, searching for answers in its pages. When night fell, the house grew colder, its shadows longer and more oppressive. Iris climbed the stairs to her room, her body heavy with exhaustion but her mind restless. She lay in bed, her thoughts circling endlessly, the sound of rain a constant backdrop. Just as sleep began to take her, she heard it again, the whisper. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the rain, but it was there, a voice, soft and insistent, calling her name. Iris sat up abruptly, her heart pounding as she stared into the darkness. The room was still, the air thick with tension. She listened intently, but the whisper did not come again. As she lay back down, the words from the book echoed in her mind. The sea whispers to those who listen, and somewhere, beyond the walls of the house, the waves crashed endlessly against the shore. Chapter 6. The Lantern in the Dark. The house felt heavier with each passing day, as though it were absorbing something deep within itself, growing fuller with each secret and each whisper. Iris could feel it, a subtle pressure in the air, a sense that the walls themselves were watching her, waiting for her to unravel their mysteries. The fog had not lifted since the day before, and now it clung even more tenaciously to the landscape, as though it had decided to stay indefinitely, wrapping everything in its opaque embrace. Iris could barely make out the outline of the cliffs outside her window, the sea a distant rumble muffled by the thick mist. Inside, the house was quieter than ever. The faint hum of the wind against the windows had become a constant companion, its eerie song filling the silence between moments of thought. Iris stood at the window, her fingers pressing against the cold glass. The house seemed to be holding its breath, each second stretched taut with anticipation. She hadn't slept well, the strange sensation of being watched lingering even in her dreams. Her eyes wandered across the room, drawn once again to the small box of photographs in the corner. She hadn't dared to open it since she found the image of the hand reaching toward the camera, but something inside her told her that it was time. With a hesitant breath, she crossed the room and lifted the box. It felt heavier than she remembered, as though it had absorbed the weight of her curiosity. She opened it carefully, the lid creaking on its hinges. The photographs lay in a neat pile, their edges worn with age. Iris picked up the first one, a photograph of a woman standing on the edge of the cliff, her back to the camera, her hair caught in the wind. It was the same cliff that Iris had walked to just days before, the same wind that had tugged at her hair, the same air that had felt so thick with meaning. She set the photo aside and pulled the next one from the box. This time, it was a close-up of a woman's hand, resting lightly on a railing, fingers splayed. It was the same hand as the one in the photograph she had found before, the same slender fingers. Iris's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the photograph, her heart pounding. There was something about it that was deeply familiar, a connection she couldn't quite place. Her eyes roamed across the photo, her pulse quickening as she noticed something else. The faintest impression of a figure, barely discernible, stood in the background, its outline distorted by the mist. It was as though someone had been standing just out of frame, watching. She set the photograph down and closed the box, her hands trembling. The connection was undeniable now. These images weren't just random. There was something about them, something that tied them together, something that tied them to her. The house groaned as though in agreement, the air growing heavier still. Iris couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that something, or someone, was lurking just beyond her sight. She stood for a moment, gathering her thoughts, and then decided to go outside. The house felt too small, its walls too close, and she needed space, even if it was just for a moment. She wrapped herself in her coat and scarf, stepping into the chill air outside. The fog wrapped around her like a shroud, the world reduced to vague shapes and indistinct shadows. The cliffs loomed ahead, their outline hazy in the mist. Iris walked toward them, her steps slow and deliberate, her mind racing. As she neared the edge, the familiar feeling of being watched returned. She stopped, glancing over her shoulder, but there was nothing there. Only the thick, unbroken fog. Yet the sensation remained, an oppressive weight on her chest. The sound of the waves was distant now, drowned out by the thick fog. It was as though the sea had retreated, leaving behind an empty silence. Iris stood at the cliff's edge, her gaze lost in the swirling mist, her thoughts a tangled mess of questions. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, barely more than a shadow, moving just out of reach. It was fleeting, a wisp of something not quite tangible, but it was there. Iris's heart skipped a beat as she turned to face it, but the figure was gone, leaving behind only the fog and the empty air. She stepped back, her breath coming faster now, her senses alert. The world around her seemed to close in, the mist swirling like a living thing. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of something beyond her understanding, something that had been waiting for her to arrive. The sound of a door creaking open broke her trance, and she turned sharply. The house stood behind her, silent and imposing in the mist. For a moment, she stood frozen, unsure whether to go toward it or stay where she was. With a reluctant breath, she turned and walked back toward the house. The figure, the feeling of being watched, the photographs, they were all connected somehow, but the answers remained elusive, slipping further out of reach with each passing day. Inside, the house felt different. The air was thick with something unspoken, a presence that seemed to hover in every room, in every corner. Iris moved through it cautiously, her mind still spinning with the events of the morning. As the hours passed, she found herself drawn back to the library, to the book she had been reading. The words from its pages seemed to echo in her mind, their meaning beginning to take shape. The sea remembers what we forget. What was it that the sea remembered? What had she forgotten? The questions swirled in her mind, but the answers remained just out of reach. As the day turned to night and the shadows in the house grew longer, Iris could feel the pull of the unknown growing stronger. She was no longer just a visitor in this house. She was a part of its story, whether she understood it or not. And somewhere, deep in the mist, something was waiting for her to uncover the truth. Chapter 7. Secrets Written in Sand. The house had not changed, yet everything within it felt subtly different. Iris awoke early that morning, the first light filtering through the fog-cloaked windows. The air was thick, as though the world beyond the walls had been softened by the mist. The rain had ceased, but the landscape outside remained a shifting dream, its contours blurred and indistinct. She had not slept well again. The shadows under her eyes were more pronounced, a testament to the restless nights spent in the company of things she could not name. The book on tides and memories remained on the desk, its pages turned and reread, but it provided no answers, only more questions. Iris stood before the mirror, brushing her hair absent-mindedly. The house felt heavy around her, as though its walls were sagging under the weight of secrets long buried. She could feel the presence of something beneath the surface, a current she could not see but knew was there, pulling at the fabric of her thoughts. After a long pause, she turned and walked slowly down the hall, her feet moving without direction. It was the familiar quiet that greeted her, but it felt different today, thicker, somehow. The stillness was oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The morning light barely touched the corners of the rooms, and the air seemed to shimmer with an intangible energy. The sense of being watched had not left her. It had only grown stronger, more pressing. Iris couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was close by, lurking just outside her perception. She found herself in the kitchen, the faint aroma of coffee from the previous evening lingering in the air. The cup from last night was still on the counter, untouched. She stared at it, unsure of what to do next. The house, with its unyielding silence, offered no answers, only the constant pull of the unknown. The creak of a floorboard above her caused her to glance upward, but the sound quickly faded. There was no one else in the house. She was alone, wasn't she? She didn't dare move. She had learned by now that the quiet in this house was deceiving. She turned back to the window, peering through the haze. The cliffs were still obscured, the sea a distant murmur. But there, near the edge of the shore, a shape caught her eye, a silhouette that appeared to be standing still against the tide. It was impossible to make out any details, but Iris knew, deep down, that it was no trick of the fog. Someone was out there. She hesitated for only a moment before heading toward the door, drawn by an unspoken compulsion. The air outside was cool and damp against her skin, and the mist clung to her like a shroud. The world was a muted blur, the sound of the sea a soft hum in the background. Iris walked toward the cliffs, her steps tentative but determined. As she neared the edge, the figure grew clearer, though still indistinct. It was as though the fog itself was cloaking the figure, allowing only the faintest outline to emerge. She stopped just shy of the cliff's edge, her breath shallow as she looked upon it. The figure was motionless, facing the endless expanse of the sea. The waves crashed below, their roar a constant undercurrent to the silence that hung in the air. Iris's pulse quickened. She felt both an overwhelming urge to approach and an equally strong instinct to turn back. For a long moment, the two of them stood there, separated by the expanse of fog and space, yet connected in some inexplicable way. Iris's hand unconsciously reached out toward the figure, as if pulled by a magnetic force. Her heart raced as the distance between them seemed to close, yet something deep within her, urged caution. The figure shifted, its movement almost imperceptible, but in that fleeting moment, Iris felt an overwhelming sensation of recognition, as though she had known this figure all her life. But before she could take another step, the figure vanished, swallowed whole by the thickening fog. Iris stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The world around her seemed to blur again, the fog closing in. She blinked, but the figure was gone, leaving behind only the empty shore and the restless sea. She turned slowly, feeling the weight of the silence settle over her once more. The house, still hidden within the mist, seemed to draw her back with its quiet insistence. Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her away from the edge and back toward the stillness of the house. The moment she stepped inside, a chill wrapped itself around her, a coldness that seemed to seep into her bones. She moved through the darkened halls, each room as silent and unyielding as the last. The sense of being watched, of something hidden in the shadows, grew stronger with every step she took. In the library, the book on tides and memories beckoned to her once more. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The answers, she felt, were within those pages. Sitting at the desk, she opened the book once more. She had memorized much of its contents, but there was one passage that had eluded her, the one she had skipped over in her earlier readings. She traced her finger along the words as they unfolded before her. The ocean is a mirror of the soul. It reflects what is hidden, what is forgotten, what is buried. To listen is to see beyond the surface, to uncover what lies beneath. Iris stared at the words for a long while, her mind trying to make sense of their meaning. Was she being asked to uncover something hidden in herself? To listen to the sea, to the house, to the things that were not yet visible? The thought unsettled her, but it also felt like the only answer she had been given. The house had always been silent, its mysteries waiting to be unraveled. But now, with the figure on the cliffs and the feeling of recognition that had come with it, she couldn't ignore the growing realization that she was not alone in this place. Not truly. The evening came quickly, the light outside fading as the fog thickened. Iris found herself once again drawn to the window, the house now a heavy, oppressive presence behind her. She stared into the void outside, but the figure, the one she had seen earlier, did not return. The house was silent again, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer peaceful. It was waiting. Iris's heart beat a little faster as she listened to the creaking of the house, the faint whisper of something stirring deep within its walls. She had felt it before. The pull, the sense that something was calling her, something that had been buried beneath the surface. The fog pressed in closer, but it no longer felt like a shroud. It felt like a veil, something that kept her from seeing what was right in front of her, something she was not yet ready to confront. The night drew on, and Iris stayed by the window, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. But the answer, she knew, was out there, somewhere, in the shadows, in the silence, in the depths of the sea. And soon, she would have no choice but to listen. Chapter 8. The Dance of Silent Souls. The fog had become a constant companion, its presence no longer an oddity but a fixture of Iris's life. It seemed to follow her, an unspoken shadow drifting just out of reach. Every day, the world beyond the house seemed to grow more distant, as though the veil separating them was thickening. The quiet was no longer just silence, it was a barrier. And yet, within that silence, something was stirring. Iris awoke to a new kind of stillness that morning, a stillness that felt even more profound than usual. The usual hum of the house, the creak of wooden beams settling, the whisper of the wind outside, had all but ceased. The air was heavy, thick with an anticipation that settled in her chest like a stone. She felt the weight of it before her feet even touched the ground. As she dressed and moved through the house, there was no sound but the soft shuffle of her own steps, no sense of life except her own. Even the faint hum of the clock on the mantel, which had always been a reassuring companion, had stilled. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Iris made her way to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking underfoot, the silence pressing closer with each step. She didn't feel hungry. She hadn't felt hungry for days, the sensation of appetite replaced by a quiet longing for something she couldn't define. She poured herself a cup of coffee, her movements slow and methodical, as if to match the stillness that surrounded her. The fog outside had not dissipated. If anything, it had thickened overnight, reducing the world beyond her window to a smudged canvas. The cliffs, the sea, even the distant horizon. Everything was cloaked, hidden beneath the same heavy blanket that seemed to weigh down her thoughts. She had spent hours at the window the previous day, staring into the mist, wondering if the figure she had seen at the cliff's edge would return. But it had not. And yet, there was a feeling, an unshakable feeling, that something was out there, that something was waiting. She set the empty coffee cup down with a soft clink and walked to the library. Her fingers traced the spines of the books on the shelf, each one a promise of discovery, but none of them seemed to offer what she sought. She needed something more, something that would unlock the quiet mystery that had been building since she first stepped into this house. As she moved further into the room, a book caught her eye, a volume she had not noticed before. It was tucked behind several others, as though it had been deliberately hidden. Its cover was worn, the title faded almost beyond recognition. With a soft breath, she reached for it, pulling it from the shelf. The cover felt heavy in her hands, its texture rough, aged by time. Iris opened the book. The pages yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. The words were difficult to decipher at first, the language archaic, but there was something about them that seemed to resonate with her. She read through the first few pages, her eyes moving quickly over the unfamiliar words, until one phrase stopped her. The house remembers what we forget. The sea remembers what the house hides. The words sent a shiver through her, a cold wave that rippled down her spine. She didn't understand the meaning, not entirely, but there was something about the sentence that felt familiar, as though it was something she had known all her life but had forgotten, buried deep within her. Her fingers lingered on the page, the edges of the paper brittle under her touch. She had the distinct impression that this book, this forgotten volume, was somehow connected to her arrival in the house, to the strange, unshakable feeling of being watched. Closing the book, Iris placed it on the desk and stood. There was something pulling at her, something urging her to go outside, to face the mist and the cliffs once more. The sense of being called had never been stronger. Without thinking, she put on her coat and stepped out the door. The air was thick with fog, the world obscured, and yet she walked with purpose, her steps sure, as though the mist itself were guiding her. The house, behind her, seemed to fade into the fog, becoming just another indistinct shadow in the distance. The cliffs were quiet today, the sea still a distant murmur beneath the blanket of fog, but as she neared the edge, the familiar figure appeared again, standing in the same spot as before, facing the ocean. This time, there was no hesitation. Iris moved toward it, drawn by the same pull she had felt before. The figure did not move, did not acknowledge her presence, but Iris knew it was waiting for her. Each step she took seemed to bring her closer to something she couldn't yet understand, and yet she felt no fear. It was as if she had always known this moment would come, as if it was written in the very fabric of her being. When she reached the edge of the cliff, she stopped, standing just behind the figure. It remained still, the fog swirling around them both like a living thing. Iris took a slow breath, her heart pounding in her chest, and then she reached out, her hand hovering just above the figure's shoulder. The moment her fingers brushed against the figure, everything changed. The world seemed to shudder, the fog parting for a fleeting second, revealing a landscape she had never seen before. A landscape that felt both familiar and utterly foreign. The cliffs were higher, the sea darker, its waves crashing against jagged rocks far below. The figure before her shifted slightly, as if acknowledging her touch, and then, in that instant, Iris saw its face. It was not a face she recognized, but it was a face she had seen before, in dreams, in the edges of her memory. It was a face from her past, long forgotten, long buried. But now it was here, standing before her, in the mist. Her heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. This figure, this presence, was tied to her in ways she couldn't yet explain. It had been waiting for her, just as she had been waiting for it. The house, the sea, the fog. They were all part of this moment, part of a story that was only just beginning to unfold. Before she could react, the figure faded once more, melting back into the fog, leaving only the whispers of the sea and the distant call of something unknown. Iris stood at the edge of the cliff, her breath coming in sharp gasps, her mind reeling with what she had seen. The connection, the bond, was undeniable. She had crossed a threshold, and there was no turning back now. The past, the house, the sea, and the figure were all part of the same truth, a truth she was now bound to uncover. As the mist closed around her once more, Iris knew that she had taken the first step into a journey from which there would be no return. Chapter 9. A touch that lingers. The days had become indistinct, fading into one another as though time itself had been caught in the same thick fog that surrounded the house. Iris moved through the motions of her life with a sense of detachment, as though she were both a participant and an observer of her own existence. Each morning, she woke to the same heavy stillness, the same muted world beyond the windows, but something had changed within her. The figure, the one that had appeared on the cliffs, lingered in her thoughts, and no matter how hard she tried to push it away, it refused to fade. The presence was undeniable, like a song she couldn't forget, a melody that played at the edges of her consciousness. She could no longer ignore the growing sense that the house was a part of this. The house, with its dark corners and silent rooms, was more than just a structure. It was a living entity, a creature with memories of its own, memories that had been buried and forgotten, waiting to be unearthed. Iris found herself returning to the library, the book that had caught her attention now open before her. The faded pages held secrets, secrets that seemed to call to her from within the yellowed ink. She read the words again, tracing her fingers along the lines that spoke of tides and memories, of houses and seas, of forgotten things that the earth itself had chosen to keep hidden. The tides remember what the earth has forgotten. The house remembers what the tides have hidden. She had read these words countless times, but now they seemed to hold a different meaning. There was a pattern here, something she had missed before. The connection between the house, the sea, and the figure. It was all starting to come together. But what did it mean? What was she supposed to do with this knowledge? The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a palpable sense of expectancy. Iris could feel it again. The pull, the call that had been growing stronger since the day she first arrived. It was as though the house itself was urging her to move, to act, to uncover what lay buried beneath its foundations. She closed the book with a snap, the sound breaking the silence like a sudden crack of thunder. Her pulse quickened as she stood, a sense of urgency rising in her chest. She needed to go out, needed to face whatever waited for her on the cliffs. The figure had appeared once before, and it would appear again. She knew this as surely as she knew the sun would rise in the morning. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and made her way to the door. The house seemed to sigh, as though it, too, had been waiting for her to take this step. The mist outside had thickened once more, but Iris paid it no mind. She stepped into the damp air, her breath misting in front of her, and began the walk toward the cliffs. The path felt familiar now, even though she knew she had never walked it before. It was as if the land itself was guiding her, pulling her forward, step by slow step. The fog pressed in around her, muffling the world, until all that existed was the sound of her own footsteps and the occasional, distant crash of waves against the rocks below. The cliffs loomed ahead, their jagged edges hidden in the swirling mist. As she reached the edge, she stopped, her eyes scanning the haze for any sign of the figure. It was there, though not in the same place as before. This time, it stood near the rocks, at the very precipice of the cliff, gazing down at the dark waters below. Iris's heart raced in her chest, her breath quickening. She had never felt more certain of anything in her life. The figure was waiting for her to take the final step. With a sense of quiet resolve, she walked toward it. The figure did not move, did not acknowledge her presence, but Iris could feel the weight of its gaze, as though it were watching her with an intensity that seemed to burn through the fog. She stopped just behind it, her eyes fixed on the dark waters below. For a long time, neither of them moved. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost unbearable, and yet it felt like the most natural thing in the world. There was no fear in Iris's heart, only a strange, calm certainty that this moment had been destined to happen. And then, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it turned to face her. The mist parted just enough to reveal its features, though its face remained partially obscured, as if the fog itself was reluctant to let it be seen clearly. Iris's pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat as she took a step closer. It was then that she saw it, the faintest glimmer, a reflection in the figure's eyes, like something far beneath the surface of the sea. It was as though the figure was not just looking at her, but through her, seeing into the very depths of her soul. Iris felt an overwhelming surge of recognition, as though she had been here before, as though she had seen this face, this presence, in a dream. The figure's lips parted slightly, but no words came. The silence stretched out between them, thick and suffocating. But there was something in the air, something that vibrated with unspoken words. Iris could feel it, like a hum beneath her skin, a whisper at the edge of her consciousness. The figure slowly raised its hand, and for a moment, Iris thought it would reach out to her, but it didn't. Instead, it pointed toward the sea, toward the dark, swirling waters that stretched out endlessly before them. The motion was not an invitation, nor a command. It was simply a gesture, as if the figure was showing her something she had been unable to see until now. Iris followed the figure's gaze, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of the shifting waters. And then, for the briefest of moments, she saw it. Beneath the surface of the water, deep and hidden in the depths, there was a shape. No, a presence. A dark silhouette that moved in time with the pulse of the sea. It was large, too large to be human, and yet, somehow, Iris knew it was watching her, waiting for her. Her heart pounded in her chest as the realization hit her like a wave. The figure, the house, the sea, it was all connected, and whatever lay beneath the surface was something that had been waiting for her to uncover it. The figure slowly lowered its hand, its gaze never leaving Iris. And in that moment, she understood. The journey she had started was not just about uncovering the house's secrets. It was about uncovering herself, confronting something buried deep within her own soul. The figure turned once more toward the sea, its form fading into the mist like a memory slipping away. Iris stood for a long moment, the fog closing in around her, the distant roar of the waves echoing in her ears. And then, without a word, she turned and walked back toward the house. The pull had not lessened. It had only grown stronger. The answers were out there, somewhere beneath the surface, and Iris knew she would have to face them, no matter the cost. As the mist thickened and the house emerged from the haze, Iris felt the weight of the future settling upon her shoulders. There was no turning back now. She had crossed a threshold, and the only way forward was through the shadows of the past. Chapter 10. The Weight of Forgotten Names. Iris woke with a sharp breath, as though she had been holding it in her sleep. The fog outside had thickened overnight, and the house seemed to have grown colder, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. Her body felt heavy, as though the very act of rising from bed required an immense effort. But it wasn't just her body that felt weighed down. It was her soul, as though something within her had stirred, something long buried that had now awoken. The house was quieter than usual, its silence oppressive in a way that felt almost suffocating. It wasn't the natural stillness she had grown accustomed to. No, this was different. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The walls seemed to lean in closer, the rooms stretching and shrinking in a subtle dance that Iris couldn't fully comprehend. The air in the hallway was thick, charged, as if the very house were alive and aware of her presence. She moved slowly, as though caught in a dream, her bare feet whispering against the cold wooden floor. The house was hers, and yet it felt as though it was always one step ahead of her. The figure on the cliff had come and gone, its presence like a shadow that hovered just out of reach, always there but never fully revealing itself. The moment it had faded from her sight had felt like a turning point, but Iris couldn't grasp why. All she knew was that something had shifted, something within her and something within the house. And now she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something much larger than herself. The day passed in a haze, the fog never lifting. Iris wandered through the rooms, her steps slow and deliberate. Each space felt more confining than the last, as though the house was closing in on her. Her fingers brushed the edges of forgotten photographs, the delicate frames now covered in dust. She lingered over them for a moment, studying the faces frozen in time. Faces she didn't recognize. But there was something unsettling in the way they looked at her, as if they knew her, as though they had been waiting for her all this time. She didn't know why she was so drawn to the old portraits. They held a sense of mystery, but not the kind that was easily solved. No, these faces were imbued with something deeper, something that seemed to pulse with each passing moment, each breath she took. It was as though they were watching her, waiting for her to unlock the secrets they held. But Iris didn't want to. She didn't want to know the truth. The truth would change everything. And yet, she couldn't stop herself. She couldn't stop searching for answers, for the connection that had eluded her since the first day she stepped into the house. Every moment, every glance, every shadow whispered of something she had yet to uncover, something just out of reach. She turned away from the portraits, but the weight of their eyes stayed with her, pressing down on her chest like an invisible hand. Later that afternoon, Iris found herself at the door again. It had become a familiar routine. The house, the figure, the sea. The fog had not lifted, but the sense of purpose that had guided her on her previous trips to the cliffs was stronger now. Something was waiting for her. Something that had been waiting for a long time. Her coat wrapped tightly around her. Iris stepped outside into the chill, the damp air clinging to her skin. The fog closed in around her, but this time, it didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a veil, a shroud that was lifting just enough for her to see beyond it. She knew where she had to go, knew without question that the figure would be there, waiting at the cliffs. The walk felt shorter now, as though the path was becoming more familiar with each step. The silence was profound, the only sound the faint murmur of the sea far below. Iris's heart beat in her chest with a rhythm she could almost hear, a quiet pulse that matched the rhythm of the earth itself. The pull, that deep, unshakable feeling that had been with her since the moment she arrived, was stronger now, guiding her toward the edge of the cliffs. When she reached the familiar spot, she wasn't surprised to find the figure there, standing at the edge of the precipice, its form obscured by the thick fog. It was still, unmoving, its presence as silent and implacable as the sea itself. Iris stopped just behind it, her heart pounding in her ears. The figure did not turn, did not acknowledge her arrival, but she could feel the weight of its awareness, the subtle way it seemed to draw her in. She stood there for a long moment, watching, waiting for something to happen. There was a sense of inevitability in the air, a quiet certainty that this moment was the next step in the journey she had already started. And then, without warning, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it turned to face her, and for the first time, Iris saw its eyes. They were not the eyes of a stranger. They were familiar, but they were not hers. They were older, wiser, filled with a depth of knowledge that sent a chill down her spine. They were eyes that had seen too much, eyes that had borne witness to things Iris couldn't even begin to comprehend. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The fog swirled around them, the sea crashing against the rocks far below. The figure seemed to study her, its gaze intense, its silence deep. Iris felt the weight of it pressing against her chest, as though it was reaching into her, pulling at something hidden within her soul. It was as if the figure knew her better than she knew herself, as if it could see into the very depths of her being. And then, finally, it spoke. Not with words, but with a gesture. The figure raised its hand and pointed toward the sea, toward the distant horizon where the fog and the waves met, a place where the earth and the sky seemed to vanish into nothingness. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was profound. It was a call, a summons. Iris felt her breath catch in her throat. She didn't know why, but she understood. The sea was not just the sea. It was a memory, a place where something had been buried long ago, something that had been forgotten by time but not by the earth itself. The sea remembered, just as the house remembered, and whatever lay hidden beneath the surface was something Iris had to uncover. The figure slowly turned away, its form fading into the mist, its presence slipping from her grasp once more. But the pull was still there. The call was still ringing in her ears, louder now, more urgent. She didn't know how she knew, but Iris understood that this was the moment when everything would change. The past had come calling, and Iris knew that she could no longer turn away. With one final look at the spot where the figure had stood, Iris turned back toward the house, the fog closing in behind her. The weight of the journey was heavy on her shoulders, but she carried it with a sense of quiet determination. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew this. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The sea had whispered her name, and now it was time to listen. Chapter 11. Fragments of a Forgotten Moon. The days were growing longer, the oppressive fog that had lingered for so many weeks finally beginning to thin. But even as the air cleared, Iris felt a growing unease, as though the very landscape around her was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. The house, too, seemed to shift with the changing light. The shadowed corners that had once felt like safe hiding places now taking on an almost threatening aspect. It was as if every room, every hallway, every corner was holding something back, something just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The figure on the cliffs had not appeared again, but Iris found that its absence weighed more heavily on her than its presence ever had. There was a strange emptiness in the air, a silence that pressed down on her, filling the space between each passing day with a sense of expectation. It was as though the house itself had paused, waiting for her to make the next move. She could no longer deny it. The house, the figure, the sea, they were all connected. She was connected to them in ways she couldn't yet understand. The memories that seemed to linger in the very walls of the house, the strange sensations that tugged at her as she wandered from room to room, all pointed to a single undeniable truth. The answers were here, hidden within these walls. But the question remained, what was she supposed to do with this knowledge? Iris could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her with every step she took. The more she uncovered, the more questions arose. The house had secrets, secrets it had been keeping for far too long. But what were they? What was it that had been buried beneath the foundation, hidden away by time and silence? The library had become her refuge in recent days. She had grown accustomed to the silence there, the only sound the faint rustle of paper as she turned the pages of the old books that filled the shelves. She had scoured every volume, looking for something, anything, that might offer an explanation. But all she had found were more cryptic passages, more fragments of forgotten histories, more words that only deepened the mystery. Yet there was one book, one she had avoided until now. It was a thick, leather-bound tome, its cover worn and weathered by time. She had seen it on the top shelf of the library, its spine cracked and stained, but something had kept her from reaching for it. It was as though the book itself had a weight, an unspoken warning that told her she was not yet ready to uncover its contents. But today, something felt different. Today, the pull of the house, the pull of the mystery that had haunted her, was too strong to ignore. Iris hesitated only for a moment before reaching up to pull the book from the shelf. As soon as her fingers brushed the cover, a shiver ran down her spine. The book felt cold in her hands, as though it had been waiting for her to unlock whatever secret it held within. She settled into the armchair by the window, the light from the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. She opened the book carefully, the brittle pages crackling under her fingertips as she turned them. The words on the pages were written in a language she couldn't quite understand, the script flowing in elegant curves and loops that seemed foreign and familiar all at once. It was as if the book were both a part of her and a world entirely removed from her own. Her eyes traced the words, the symbols, but they offered no meaning. Instead, her gaze was drawn to the illustrations that accompanied the text, drawings of the house, of the cliffs, of the sea. And then, among the sketches, there was one that stopped her heart. A figure, standing on the cliffs. It was not the same figure that had appeared to her before, but there was something in the posture, in the way the figure was positioned, that sent a chill through her. The figure's face was obscured, but the hands were outstretched, reaching toward the sea as if calling something out of the depths. The drawing was detailed, the shadows giving it an almost lifelike quality, and as Iris looked at it, she felt a strange sensation, a pull, deep and undeniable, like a memory she couldn't place. There, in the margins of the page, was a single word written in the same script, Everwake. Iris's breath caught in her throat. The word felt like a key to something she had been searching for, something just beyond her reach. She didn't know why, but she felt an overwhelming urge to know more. She needed to understand the meaning of that word and why it seemed so important. She turned the page, but the next illustration made her pause. It was another drawing of the house, but this time, there was something different about it. In the background, faintly sketched in the distance, was the same figure from the cliffs. This time standing at the edge of the house, staring up at the windows as though it were waiting for someone. But it wasn't the house she recognized. The windows were different, the shape of the building unfamiliar. It was the same house, but it was not. Iris closed the book abruptly, a surge of frustration rising within her. She couldn't make sense of it all. The book offered no answers, only more questions. And yet, deep inside, she knew it was a piece of the puzzle. One more part of the mystery that had been set in motion the moment she had arrived. She set the book down on the table and stood, her gaze drifting to the window where the last light of the day was fading into the horizon. The sea was visible in the distance, a stretch of dark water that seemed to merge with the sky. It was as though the world beyond the house was waiting for her to take the next step, to make the decision that would lead her to whatever truth lay hidden beneath the surface. The figure had not appeared, but she knew it was watching. It had been waiting, and it was calling to her. The sea had whispered her name, and now it was time for Iris to listen. She stepped away from the table, her heart beating faster now, the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. She didn't know what would happen when she crossed the threshold of the house, when she stepped into the unknown, but she knew that she had to go, and this time, she would not be alone. Chapter 12. Between Two Heartbeats. The morning light streamed into the house, filtering through the thin veil of mist that still clung to the windows. It was the first clear day in weeks, and yet, as Iris stood by the window, the stillness of the air felt more suffocating than the fog had ever been. There was an unease in the silence, a quiet tension that seemed to pulse through the very walls. It was as if the house itself was waiting, holding its breath for something that was about to unfold, something she had yet to understand. Iris had spent the entire night pacing, restless and unsettled by the events of the previous day. The book had offered no immediate answers, only more cryptic images and words that left her with more questions than before. But there was something about the word Everwake that haunted her, an echo that reverberated through her thoughts every time she closed her eyes. It was as though the word itself held the key to unlocking everything that had brought her to this place, everything that lay hidden within the house, the sea, the figure on the cliffs. But the more she thought about it, the more it seemed that Everwake wasn't just a word. It was a place, a time, something that existed beyond the surface of the present. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been stretched and twisted, creating a space between what she could see and what she could not. A space where the house, the figure, and the sea all met. And yet, no matter how hard she tried, Iris couldn't make sense of it. The house was old, its bones heavy with the weight of its past, its walls holding memories that stretched back farther than she could imagine. But there was something more, something in the way the house seemed to know her, as if it had been waiting for her all this time. The quiet whispers that seemed to echo through the rooms, the subtle shifting of shadows, these were not mere tricks of the mind. They were something more. They were a message, a call that had been set in motion long before she had arrived. Iris turned away from the window and walked slowly through the house, her fingers trailing along the walls as though they might reveal something hidden, something buried just beneath the surface. The house felt different today, as though it had changed overnight. The air was thick with the scent of earth and dust, and the silence was almost deafening. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, as though the floor beneath her was becoming a part of her, connecting her to something deep within the earth itself. As she passed by the hallway, something caught her eye. The door to the basement, an old, wooden door that she had avoided since her arrival, stood slightly ajar. She had never been inside, not since the first time she had stepped into the house. There had always been a part of her that knew she wasn't supposed to go down there, a part of her that recognized that there was something locked away in the dark depths of the house. But now, something was different. The door was open, as if it had been waiting for her, as if it had been calling to her all along. The air around the basement door felt heavier, denser, as though the weight of something long forgotten was pressing against it, begging to be let out. Iris hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering just inches from the door's cool, splintered surface. The sound of her own breath seemed deafening in the quiet space, and for a moment, she wondered if she was truly ready for what lay beyond. But she couldn't turn away. The pull was too strong. The door creaked open with a soft groan, revealing a narrow staircase that led downward into the dark. The air smelled musty, stale, like something long hidden, and yet there was a faint, almost imperceptible scent beneath it, a scent she couldn't quite place, but one that felt intimately familiar, like a memory she had forgotten. Iris descended the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the silence. The darkness seemed to swallow her, pulling her deeper into the house's forgotten heart. The stone walls pressed in on her, the cold air growing more oppressive with each passing moment. And then, at the bottom of the stairs, she saw it. It was a small room, almost hidden from view, with a low ceiling and a floor covered in dust. In the center of the room stood an old chest, its wooden surface cracked and worn with age. There was no mistaking the feeling that washed over Iris as she stepped into the room. This was the place. This was where everything had begun, where it had all been hidden away. She could feel it in her bones, the weight of the secret that lay locked within the chest, the secret that had been waiting for her to find it. Iris approached the chest slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The room seemed to close in around her, the air growing thick with anticipation. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and grasped the heavy lid. It creaked as she lifted it, revealing the contents within. Inside the chest, there was a small bundle wrapped in a faded cloth. The cloth was old, the fabric frayed at the edges, but there was something undeniably alive about it, as if the contents were something that had been waiting to be touched, to be uncovered. Her breath caught in her throat as she unwrapped the bundle, revealing what lay hidden beneath. It was a book. The cover was dark, almost black, with a symbol etched into the surface. The symbol was familiar, though Iris couldn't quite place it. She had seen it before, perhaps in her dreams, or in the illustrations from the book she had read in the library. But it was not the symbol that caught her attention. It was the sensation that surged through her as she held the book in her hands. It was as if the book itself was alive, as if it had been waiting for her, just as the house had. Iris opened the book cautiously, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. The script was the same as the one in the other book, elegant, flowing, but ultimately indecipherable. Her fingers traced the edges of the pages, a deep sense of foreboding settling over her. The words seemed to pulse beneath her touch, as if they were alive, waiting for her to understand. But as she flipped through the pages, something began to change. The words, once a blur, began to shift, to twist before her eyes. The symbols rearranged themselves, the ink flowing and changing. as if the very book was rewriting itself in response to her presence. It was as though the book was speaking directly to her, revealing something that had been hidden for centuries. Iris's hands trembled as the pages began to reveal their true meaning. The book was telling her a story of the house, of the figure, of the sea. And as the words took shape in her mind, the house around her seemed to respond, the walls groaning as though they, too, were awakening from a long slumber. The room was no longer still. The air was thick with the energy of the house, the presence of something ancient and powerful. It was as if the house itself had begun to speak, as though it had been waiting for her to unlock the secret hidden in the depths of its walls. And as Iris continued to read, she realized one undeniable truth. The house was alive, and it had chosen her. Chapter 13. Echoes of an Unspoken Love. The winds had shifted again, not in the way one would expect, as a gentle breeze that rustled the trees and sighed through the leaves. No, this wind was different. It felt like a whisper, low and hushed, brushing against her skin as though it carried a secret meant only for her. Iris stood by the open window, watching as the world outside seemed to bend and twist in the glow of the rising sun. The sea had turned a deep shade of blue, reflecting the skies above in a way that almost made the horizon seem like an illusion, an endless stretch of water and light where reality and dream blended. The events of the past few days had left Iris in a state of strange suspension. The book in her hands, the one she had found in the basement, held a weight beyond words. Every night since, she had read it until exhaustion overcame her, only to wake up to a world that felt both familiar and terrifyingly distant. The words had etched themselves into her mind. The symbols that once seemed foreign now settled into her thoughts like old friends. They guided her in dreams and waking hours, leading her toward a truth that she could no longer avoid. The house had changed. She could feel it in her every step. The air inside felt charged now, as if it hummed with life, every room vibrating with an energy that was both unnerving and magnetic. The old furniture, the heavy curtains, even the dust. It all seemed to speak to her, to reach for her in a way that felt deliberate, almost personal. And the feeling of being watched, that sensation she could never shake, had only grown stronger. But it was the sea that had called to her most, its steady rhythm pulling her, beckoning her toward the cliffs. It was an undeniable force, as if the ocean itself recognized her and was reaching out with waves of memory that seemed to stir the very core of her being. Iris had not yet returned to the cliffs since the night she first saw the figure. The image of it, its presence so ethereal, so full of intent, had not left her mind. It stood on the rocks, distant and impossible to reach, and yet something about its gaze had struck deep into her heart. The longing, the sorrow in its posture, was something she understood, something she had come to realize she carried with her. She had been drawn toward it then, just as she was now, but today felt different. The wind, the way the light hit the water, even the quiet murmur of the house, it all seemed to align, like pieces of a puzzle sliding into place. Today, she knew it was time to go. She moved through the house slowly, her footsteps soft against the wooden floors as she crossed from room to room, feeling the weight of each step as though the house itself was urging her to move faster. The book was tucked beneath her arm, the one that had revealed so many truths but offered so many more questions. She had learned more about the figure on the cliffs, but not enough. There were parts of the story, parts of her story, that had yet to be uncovered. She needed to know more. The answers, she believed, were out there, waiting for her in the folds of the landscape, hidden in the sea and the sky, in the cliffs that rose like sentinels against the horizon. The path to the cliffs was worn, the grass on either side bending under the pressure of countless steps over the years. It was an ancient road, one that had been walked by countless others before her, But as Iris made her way down it, she couldn't shake the feeling that this time, she was not alone. It wasn't just the house watching her now. It was something deeper, something that had always been there, watching from the shadows, waiting for her to awaken. The first glimpse of the cliffs made her heart race. The jagged rocks jutted from the earth like ancient fingers reaching for the sky, the sea crashing below them in a chaotic rhythm. It was a view both beautiful and terrifying. Iris felt small against the vastness of it all, the world stretching out before her like an endless expanse of water and sky. She walked closer to the edge, feeling the wind whip around her, pushing her hair back from her face, as if urging her to come closer, to step into the unknown. She stood there for a long time, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her, the sound of the waves below echoing in her ears. And then she saw it. The figure. It was standing again, just as it had the first time she had seen it, on the very edge of the cliff, its form dark against the bright expanse of the sky. The figure's features were still hidden, its back turned toward her as though it had been waiting for her arrival, as if it knew she would come. It was not the same as it had been before. This time, there was something different about it, something more urgent, more alive. The sense of recognition swept over Iris like a wave. She knew it wasn't a person, not in the way she had once understood the term. This was something else, something older and more profound. The figure had no face, no identity that she could place. Yet Iris felt as though she knew it intimately, as though it had always been a part of her, a fragment of her past that had been hidden from her until now. Her breath caught in her throat as she took a step forward, drawn toward the figure as if it were a beacon, a guiding light. But just as quickly as the urge to move struck her, a voice, soft but firm, echoed in her mind. "Don't go any closer." The words were not spoken, but they were clear nonetheless. They rang in her ears, vibrating through her very soul. The warning was not a sound. It was a presence, a pulse that resonated with everything in her being. And yet, despite the warning, despite the rising sense of danger that gnawed at her insides, Iris couldn't move away. Her legs felt rooted to the ground, and her body, as if it had a will of its own, stepped forward again. The figure turned, slowly, its movement as fluid as water, its face still hidden in shadow. But the gesture was unmistakable. It was waiting for her. And that's when Iris understood. The figure was not just a symbol of something lost. It was a key to something deeper, something beyond the house and the sea. It was a key to the truth that had been buried for so long, waiting for her to unlock it. The world around her seemed to bend in that moment, the air thick with energy, as if the very fabric of reality had been pulled taut, waiting for the thread to snap. Iris stepped closer to the figure, her heart pounding in her chest, the pull of the unknown stronger than ever before. She was on the edge, standing between two worlds, between the past and the present, between what was and what could be. And as she reached out, as her fingers brushed against the cold stone of the cliff's edge, the air seemed to shimmer, and she knew. This was no longer a question of whether she would understand. The truth was waiting for her, and it was finally within reach. Chapter 14. The Edge of Solitude. The storm came suddenly, as though the sky itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the moment to exhale. The first gust of wind tore through the cliffs, sending a shiver down Iris's spine as she stood at the edge, still mesmerized by the figure. It had moved closer, its presence now like a force she could not resist. But as the wind began to howl, she realized that the moment of clarity she had felt moments before was slipping away. The world felt unstable, as if the ground beneath her feet was no longer as solid as it once was. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive, and the figure was no longer a quiet, waiting presence, but something that seemed to pulse with a hidden power, one that tugged at the very core of her. Iris stepped back, her eyes fixed on the figure, whose form still stood as it had before, unwavering, distant, but undeniably connected to her. The wind surged around her, as if urging her to turn away, but her feet remained rooted, locked to the spot. The landscape had begun to blur, the sea's waves crashing wildly against the rocks below, the air thickening with an energy that was both familiar and foreign. It felt as though the storm had come not to disrupt, but to reveal something hidden, something long buried. And then, there it was, an answer that had been waiting for her all along, but one she had not yet been able to see. The figure did not speak, could not speak, but the energy it exuded was unmistakable. Iris understood now, in a way that bypassed logic, bypassed words. This was no apparition. It was the embodiment of something forgotten, something from the past that had been lost to time, hidden in the folds of memory. It was not just a messenger. It was the past itself, reaching out to her, demanding to be remembered. Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud crack, the sound of thunder splitting the sky, and then the rain came, heavy, relentless, drenching her within moments. The chill of the water clung to her skin, the cold biting through her clothes as she stood there, frozen by the overwhelming sense of knowing that flooded her. The figure before her had never been separate from her. It was her, or rather, a version of her, one that had been hidden, buried beneath layers of time, of events that had been forgotten, erased by forces greater than the earth itself. For a long time, Iris stood at the cliff's edge, the storm battering her with relentless force, but she felt no urge to flee. It was as though her very soul had been tethered to the sea, to the figure, to the house, and in that tethering, she found herself facing the truth. The figure, which had once seemed like an enigma, was now as familiar to her as her own reflection. She had always known it, and yet she had never truly seen it. The memories, long suppressed, began to surface in fragments, scattered like shards of glass. She could see flashes of her own face, older, perhaps, but unmistakably her. And behind those fleeting images were more. More faces, more places, all of them tangled together in a web that she could no longer untangle. The house, the sea, the book. They were all connected, inseparable threads woven into a tapestry that told a story far older than her own. The rain continued to fall, drenching her through and through, but Iris felt no cold. The storm seemed to dissolve, leaving only the figure before her. Its form was still shrouded in shadow, but now she understood it wasn't its shape that mattered. It was the essence of it, the unspoken promise it carried. She had to return. She had to return to the place where it all began. But the storm was not the only thing that had changed in this moment. The wind had shifted, and with it, the very landscape. Iris could feel the ground beneath her tremble, a low, almost imperceptible rumble that spoke of something immense and ancient stirring beneath the earth's surface. The house, distant as it was, seemed to groan in response, a deep sound that resonated through the very air, echoing against the cliffs. The connection was complete now. She could feel it in the very marrow of her bones. Without thinking, Iris turned away from the cliffs, the figure's shadow still etched into her mind, and began to walk back toward the house. The wind, the storm, the heavy rain, they no longer mattered. She had seen the truth now. The house was not just a building. It was alive, a living entity that had been waiting for her to return, waiting for her to remember. It had chosen her, not by chance, but by design. As she walked, the world around her seemed to shift, to bend at the edges, as though reality itself was being rewritten. The path before her had never seemed so long, yet so familiar. It was as if every step she took brought her closer not just to the house, but to herself, to the version of herself that had been buried for so long. She could hear the faintest of whispers now, calling her name, not from a voice, but from the very air itself, from the walls that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of their own. The house was speaking to her, urging her to return, urging her to unlock the final mystery. By the time Iris reached the door, she felt as though she had crossed some invisible threshold. The house, which had once felt distant, now seemed to envelop her, to recognize her as its own. The door opened before she could even touch it, as though it had been waiting for her arrival. The warmth inside felt like a stark contrast to the chill of the storm outside, but it was a warmth that was not of the world. This was a warmth that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves. The house was calling her in. She stepped inside. The walls greeted her with the same hum, the same pulsing energy that she had felt before. The shadows here were deeper, longer, and yet they seemed to bend around her, as though they were not shadows at all, but something far more substantial, something alive. The air smelled of earth, of dust, but beneath that, there was a faint trace of something sweeter, something almost familiar. She moved through the room slowly, as if guided by some unseen force. The house felt different now. The silence was no longer oppressive but comforting, as though it had finally found its balance after years of unrest. The deeper she ventured, the more she felt the pull of something powerful, something that had been hidden in the very bones of the house, waiting for this moment to come. Iris found herself drawn to the basement once again, the same feeling of inevitability that had led her there the first time now guiding her steps. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the staircase that led down into the darkness. But the darkness was not the same as it had been before. It was alive, humming with the same energy that filled the house, that filled her. She descended the stairs once more, and when she reached the bottom, she saw it. The chest was open. The book, the one she had buried in the floorboards all those nights ago, was now resting on top, its pages turned as if someone had been reading it in her absence. The figure was no longer distant. It had come to her. With trembling hands, Iris reached for the book once again. As she touched the pages, the words seemed to leap into focus, clearer than they had ever been. The final revelation was here. The house, the sea, the figure. They were all parts of the same story. Her story. The truth had come, and with it, the power to change everything. Chapter 15. A Flame in the Abyss. The dawn arrived as quietly as the night had departed, the first light of morning creeping in through the edges of the curtains, casting a pale glow across the room. Iris lay on the floor, the book still in her hands. The pages turned to a passage she couldn't yet bring herself to fully understand. The house felt different now, quieter, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. But what? The question nagged at the back of her mind, persistent and sharp. Iris had seen things, pieces of herself, fragmented memories, visions that made no sense but felt undeniable. There was no escaping the feeling that something was on the edge of revelation, something that had been buried for so long it had woven itself into the very fabric of her being. The storm had passed, but the air inside the house still crackled with energy, the atmosphere thick with something intangible, something beyond comprehension. She had returned to the house, but she had not returned the same. The storm, the figure, the book, all of it had changed her. The truth she had uncovered was not just an answer, but a key that unlocked more questions, questions that she was not ready to face, yet could not ignore. Iris stood up slowly, stretching her arms above her head. The cold floor beneath her feet seemed to ground her, to anchor her to this place as if the house itself were pulling her deeper into its mysteries. The walls were no longer just walls, but entities in their own right, their presence more solid than anything in the outside world. The floors beneath her were not wood. They were something more, something older, a living part of the house, its pulse like a heartbeat that never ceased. She turned to the window, the soft light of the morning now fully illuminating the landscape beyond. The sea sparkled in the distance, calm after the storm, its surface smooth and inviting. But she did not feel the same pull toward it now. The figure had been on the cliffs, but now, the sea itself seemed distant, like a part of her life that she could no longer return to. The storm had passed, and the clarity it had brought was fading into a fog of uncertainty. She had felt the truth in her bones, in the very marrow of her being. But now it was slipping away like sand through her fingers, leaving her grasping for something she could not hold. It was the house that held her now, that wrapped itself around her like an embrace she couldn't escape. The walls whispered, and Iris could almost hear the voices. Those same whispers that had guided her in the past. But now, they were louder, clearer, urging her to follow them deeper into the heart of the house. The basement, the one place she had yet to explore fully, called to her once more, its pull stronger than before. A magnetic force that seemed to grow with each passing moment. She walked toward the stairs without hesitation, the weight of the house's energy settling over her like a cloak. There was no fear now. There was only the undeniable sense of need, as though this was the moment she had been waiting for, the culmination of all the restless nights, the restless days, all leading to this. The house was waiting for her, just as the figure had waited. But the figure was not the only mystery left to uncover. The house held its own secret, a truth that had yet to be revealed, a truth she could no longer deny. The stairs creaked beneath her feet as she descended, but they felt more solid than ever before, the steps seeming to guide her rather than simply support her weight. Each descent, each movement closer to the basement, felt like a step closer to an awakening. She could feel it in the air around her, the electric charge that seemed to hum through the walls, through the very fabric of the house. It wasn't just the house. It was the world around her, warping, shifting, aligning with something far older, something far more powerful than she could ever have imagined. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement door loomed, but it was no longer just a door. It was a threshold, a boundary between the known and the unknown. It was a portal that led to something Iris had been seeking all along, even though she hadn't fully understood what it was until now. The door opened without a sound, the hinges moving as if they had been oiled for years, though they had not been touched in ages. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of earth and wood, the shadows stretching long and deep in the dim light. The book, the one she had placed on the table just the day before, was gone. Her heart skipped a beat. She had not left it open. Had she? Had she? But the book was not the only thing that was missing. The chest, the one that had held the book in the first place, was gone as well. All that remained was an empty space where they had once been. The floorboards stripped bare, the dust settled like a final layer of silence. Panic surged through Iris, but it was not the same panic that had gripped her before. This was different. This was not a fear of the unknown, but a fear that something had been taken from her, something that could never be returned. The realization hit her like a blow. The house had been changing in ways she couldn't comprehend, the walls shifting, the rooms rearranging. The house had become something more than just a home. It was a living entity, one that could act on its own, one that could take what it needed when it needed it. Her gaze fell to the far corner of the basement, where a small, unremarkable door stood. It was a door she had never noticed before. There had never been a door there. Not in any of the maps, not in any of her memories. And yet, there it was, hidden in plain sight, as though it had always been part of the house, waiting for her to find it. Iris took a step toward it, the urge to open it overwhelming. The whispers of the house grew louder, more insistent, as though they were calling her to open the door, to step beyond it into whatever waited on the other side. Her hand rested on the doorknob, and for a moment, she hesitated. Was she ready for this? For whatever the house had in store for her? Was she prepared to uncover the final pieces of the puzzle, even if it meant losing herself in the process? But there was no turning back now. The house had chosen her. It had always chosen her. With a deep breath, Iris turned the knob, and the door creaked open. Beyond it lay a room she had never seen before, a room that seemed to exist in defiance of all logic. It was a space that defied time itself, the air thick with the scent of ages past, the walls lined with strange symbols and markings that seemed to shift and dance in the dim light. The room was filled with shadows, but in the center, bathed in a soft, ethereal glow, was a pedestal. And on the pedestal was something Iris could not quite comprehend. The object was a mirror, an old, ornate mirror, its frame carved from wood that seemed to pulse with life. The surface of the mirror was not clear. Instead, it rippled like water, reflecting not the room before her, but a different time, a different place. Iris stepped forward, drawn to it, unable to resist the pull. The mirror seemed to call to her, beckoning her closer. As she stood before it, the world around her began to fade. The shadows of the room grew deeper, the whispers louder, and the mirror's surface began to shimmer. And then, Iris saw it, the truth, not in words, not in images, but in a single, unshakable feeling. She had always known. The house, the book, the figure. It had all been leading her here, to this moment, to the unraveling of the thread that had bound her to this place for so long. She reached out, her hand trembling as it moved toward the mirror, knowing that once she touched it, everything would change, and there would be no going back. Chapter 16. The Promise of a New Dawn. The surface of the mirror was like liquid glass, its undulating surface pulling Iris closer with an almost magnetic force. She stood before it, her hand trembling as it hovered just above the cool, smooth edge, and yet she felt no fear, only an intense curiosity, a pull deeper than anything she had felt before. The house around her seemed to vanish, the distant hum of its presence fading into the background, replaced by a profound silence that swallowed her whole. The whispers that had once been so clear were now drowned by an eerie stillness. It was as if the world had held its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. Her fingers brushed the edge of the mirror, and immediately, the ripples spread across its surface, distorting the reflection. But it was not her reflection that she saw. It was something else, something far older, something far more ancient. A flash of darkened eyes, the sharp contours of a face that was both familiar and distant, a memory that danced just beyond her reach. For a moment, it felt as if the reflection was alive, watching her, assessing her, pulling her into its depths. The room around her seemed to stretch, the edges becoming hazy, as though the mirror itself was not just a reflection of the present, but a portal to something more. The walls of the room began to blur, their details smearing into shadows, the very air growing thick with a weight that pressed against her chest. She could feel it now, the presence behind her, the shadow that had been with her all along. She had known it was there, had felt its pull ever since her return to the house, and now it was undeniable. The mirror shimmered again, its surface swirling like a stormy ocean, and Iris's heartbeat quickened. She knew, without understanding how, that it was calling her. The mirror was not just showing her something. It was asking her to step through, to cross over into whatever lay on the other side. The house, the figure, the book. It had all led her here, to this moment, to this choice. She could feel the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak, the gravity of it pulling at her very soul. There was no going back once she stepped through. The life she had known, the world she had come from, would no longer exist in the same way. The mirror was a threshold, and the path beyond it was shrouded in mystery. But it was a mystery she could no longer deny. The air around her crackled with energy, and her pulse thrummed in time with the beating of the house. She could almost hear it now, the steady thrum of life beneath the floorboards, beneath the earth. It was not just the house that was alive. It was everything, the very fabric of the world around her, humming with an energy that had been waiting for this moment. This was no ordinary mirror, no ordinary reflection. It was the gateway to something far beyond her comprehension. With a deep breath, Iris stepped forward, her hand now pressing against the mirror's surface. The instant her skin touched the cool glass, the world around her seemed to dissolve. The shadows of the room slipped away, and the mirror's surface rippled, pulling her in like a tide. The sensation was not of passing through a solid object, but of being submerged in something alive, something fluid, as though the very air had become thick with meaning. For a brief moment, there was nothing but the feeling of weightlessness, of being suspended in time and space. It was as if she had stepped into another dimension, one where the rules of reality no longer applied. The house, the figure, the world beyond, everything was gone. She was alone, adrift in an endless, boundless space. And then, the pull of the mirror became stronger, more insistent. It was as if the reflection had been waiting for her to cross over, to meet it halfway. She was no longer just an observer. She was a part of it, her presence interwoven with the very fabric of the space around her. The world began to take shape again, but it was not the world she had known. The landscape that stretched before her was unfamiliar, a twisted version of the house she had left behind. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and old wood, and the sky above was a deep, bruised purple, streaked with flashes of unnatural light. The ground beneath her feet was soft, like moss, but the texture shifted and changed with every step she took. Iris looked around, her breath catching in her throat. The scene was both beautiful and disturbing, a strange amalgamation of familiar and foreign. There were trees, twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching toward the sky like outstretched fingers, but they did not seem alive in the way she knew. Their leaves shimmered, flickering like memories, fading in and out of focus as if they were not truly part of this world. There, in the distance, stood the house she had left behind. But it was different now. It was larger, more imposing, its shape distorted, as if it had grown to accommodate whatever strange force held this place together. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, as though the house itself was breathing, living, waiting. Iris felt a shiver run down her spine, but she didn't hesitate. There was no choice now. She had come this far. There was no turning back. With each step toward the house, the air grew denser, more suffocating. The whispers, now louder, swirled around her, but they were not voices in the traditional sense. They were feelings, emotions that passed through her, tugging at her consciousness. Fear, desire, sorrow. Each emotion felt like a wave crashing over her, leaving her breathless and disoriented. She reached the door, but it was not the same door. The wood was ancient, weathered, with markings that seemed to shift as she looked at them. The door was not closed, not locked, but open, as if waiting for her to enter. And so, Iris stepped across the threshold. The moment she crossed into the house, she was not greeted by the familiar warmth of its walls. Instead, the temperature dropped, the air turning cold and still, as though time itself had frozen. The house stretched before her, its corridors endless, the rooms unfamiliar, yet she knew, somehow, deep within her, this was where she was meant to be. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as though they were calling to her, urging her to follow a path she could not yet see. The house was guiding her, but to where? What was waiting for her here, beyond the veil of the mirror? Her heart raced as she walked down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Every door she passed seemed to pulse with a strange energy, but none of them opened. She could hear something faint, a sound that seemed to be coming from deep within the walls. It was rhythmic, like a heartbeat, steady and constant. The house was alive, but there was something else beneath that life. Something dark, something that had been waiting, just as she had been waiting, for this moment. She reached a door at the end of the hallway. It was different from the others. There was no mistaking it. This was the door she had been searching for. The whispers intensified, their voices now all around her. But it was not the whispers that drew her attention. It was the door itself. The symbols on its surface, familiar yet strange, seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Iris's hand hovered over the doorknob, but she did not open it immediately. There was something about this moment that felt significant, something about this door that seemed to hold the key to everything she had been seeking. With a deep breath, she turned the knob. The door opened, and she stepped into the darkness beyond. Chapter 17. Fates Entwined by Shadows. The darkness behind the door was suffocating, an oppressive weight that pressed against Iris's chest as she stepped across the threshold. It was not the familiar silence of the house, the kind that comforted her in its stillness. This was something else entirely, an emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever, deeper than anything she had encountered before. The air felt heavier here, colder, as though the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Iris's feet sank into the ground, the floor beneath her soft, yielding, as if the house itself were a living organism that responded to her presence. She hesitated, uncertain of the path ahead, but the pull, that incessant call, tugged at her like a magnet. The house had led her here for a reason, and she could feel it now, the undeniable sensation that everything she had experienced, everything she had uncovered, had brought her to this very moment. The room stretched before her, vast and unknowable, the walls lost in shadow. It was a place beyond time, a place where the usual rules no longer applied. There was no sense of direction, no clear shape to the space she now occupied. It felt as though she had stepped outside of reality, into something far more ancient, something that had always been there, waiting for her to arrive. A soft sound broke the silence, so faint at first that Iris wasn't sure she had heard it at all. It was a whisper, but not a human one. It was like the wind, the rustling of leaves, the faint creak of wood settling. The noise swirled around her, filling the space with a presence that seemed to reach into her very soul. It was familiar, yet foreign, as though the house itself had come alive with something more than just a physical presence. There was history here, ancient, deep, and raw, and Iris could feel it in her bones. She took a step forward, the soft pressure of the ground beneath her shifting with every movement. The room was so vast that it seemed to swallow her whole, her own steps swallowed by the cavernous expanse. But then, something shifted in the distance, a flicker of light, so subtle that it was almost imperceptible, but it was there. It beckoned to her. Iris moved towards it, her steps slow, deliberate, though every instinct in her body screamed to turn back. But she could not. The house had led her here, had drawn her through the mirror, through the door, and now there was no choice but to follow it to the end. Whatever awaited her beyond that light was a part of the puzzle, a piece that would complete the fractured pieces of her understanding. The light grew brighter as she neared, until it bloomed before her, and for a moment, Iris was struck by the sheer beauty of it. It was not harsh or blinding, but soft, a pale glow that seemed to pulse gently, as though it was alive. It illuminated a small pedestal in the center of the room, and atop it rested a crystal, its facets gleaming in the dim light, reflecting a spectrum of colors that danced across the room. Iris stood before it, transfixed by the object. It was beautiful, its edges sharp, its surface smooth, But it was not the crystal that held her gaze. It was the feeling it evoked. There was something deeply familiar about it, something that resonated within her, as if it had always been a part of her, waiting to be reclaimed. The crystal seemed to pulse with a rhythm, a heartbeat that mirrored her own, and she felt the pull again, stronger now, more insistent. It was the house, yes, but there was something more. Something that had been hidden for too long, something she had been running from. The room shifted once more, the shadows deepening, the light flickering and fading as the crystal's glow intensified. Iris reached out, her fingers trembling as they neared the surface of the crystal. The moment her skin made contact with it, a surge of energy shot through her, so powerful that it took her breath away. The room seemed to lurch, as though the very space around her was warping, bending under the weight of what had been unlocked. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she was no longer standing in that vast, empty space. She was somewhere else, somewhere far older, far deeper. She was standing in a different time, in a different place. The walls around her were no longer just empty shadows. They were alive with history, with the weight of memories long forgotten. She could hear voices now, whispers, like the ones that had guided her through the house. But these were different. They were ancient, layered with grief and longing, and they seemed to come from all directions, surrounding her, pressing in. The sound was both beautiful and terrifying, and she could feel herself drowning in it, unable to escape. But then, the voices began to take shape. They became clearer, more distinct, and as they did, so did the memories that accompanied them. Iris was no longer alone. She was surrounded by figures, shadows that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, each one carrying the weight of a story untold, a history buried deep within the walls of the house. These were not just voices, not just echoes of the past. They were people, long forgotten, trapped within the very fabric of the house. Iris could feel their presence, could sense their emotions, their fears, their desires. It was overwhelming, suffocating, but she could not turn away. There was something she needed to understand, something that had been lost to time but was now on the verge of being revealed. The figures in the room shifted, and one by one, they began to take form. Faces emerged from the shadows, unfamiliar yet strangely familiar, their eyes wide and full of unspoken secrets. She recognized none of them, and yet, she felt a deep connection to them. They were part of her, part of the house, part of the truth she had been seeking. And then, in the midst of it all, a figure stepped forward, a woman, her face half obscured in shadow, but her eyes piercing, as if they could see straight into Iris's soul. There was a sadness in her gaze, a sorrow so deep that it seemed to pull at Iris's heart, as though the weight of centuries had settled into the woman's very being. The figure spoke, but not with words. It was not a voice that reached Iris's ears. It was a feeling, a sensation that seeped into her bones. She understood, though she could not explain how. The house was not just a house. It was a keeper of memories, a vessel for the past. It had held these people, held their stories, their lives, their pain. And now, it was reaching out, asking Iris to bear witness. The woman's gaze softened, as though she was trying to convey something important, something that Iris needed to know. The figure reached out, and Iris instinctively stepped closer, feeling the pulse of the crystal in her hand, now almost unbearably strong. As the woman's hand passed through the air, the space around Iris began to unravel, the world shifting once again, the walls and shadows giving way to something else, something beyond time, beyond space. The light dimmed once more, and Iris blinked. When she opened her eyes, the room was gone. The crystal was no longer in her hand. The echo of the whispers had faded, and the weight of the presence that had surrounded her lifted. But the question remained. The truth was still just beyond her reach. And the house, still alive, still waiting, knew that Iris was not done yet. The final piece was still missing. Chapter 18. The Last Ray of Light. The silence was deafening. Iris stood at the threshold of the final room, the place she had been drawn toward from the very beginning. The air was thick, still, carrying the scent of age and decay, as though time itself had forgotten to pass here. Every corner of the space seemed to hold a memory, a piece of the house that had waited for her to arrive. Now, the house was no longer a place of shadows and whispers. It was a vessel, and she had come to understand its purpose. But there was no turning back now. Whatever truth had been buried here, whatever secrets lay beneath the foundation of this house, she was the one who had to face them. The figures from her vision, the woman with the piercing eyes, had made it clear. The house was not just a home. It was a prison, a keeper of lost souls, bound by the past and the forces that lived within it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped into the room, the soft sound of her footsteps the only noise in the vast, empty space. The walls seemed to close in around her, though she knew they were as they had always been. The house had never been just a structure. It was a living entity, as much a part of her as the blood in her veins. The center of the room was empty save for a small pedestal. It was simple, unremarkable in design, yet Iris could feel the weight of its presence. The pedestal was not just a piece of furniture. It was the culmination of everything that had brought her here. Atop it lay a book, its cover worn and faded with age, but there was a strange energy emanating from it. It called to her, a familiar pull, like the final note of a song that had lingered in the background for far too long, waiting for its resolution. Iris approached the pedestal, her hand instinctively reaching for the book, the moment of truth finally within her grasp. But as her fingers brushed against its surface, she stopped, a cold shiver running down her spine. It was not fear, but understanding. She could feel the weight of the book in a way she had never felt before. A burden, an echo of the house's history, of everything that had led up to this point. She had been chosen, but she had also chosen. She had walked through each door, each passage, led by the house, but never truly knowing where she was going. She lifted the book, feeling the faint pulse of energy that seemed to surge from it, thrumming beneath her fingertips like a heartbeat. The room shifted again, the shadows deepening and swirling around her, as if the very walls were watching, waiting for her to open it. Iris hesitated, her heart racing, but she knew she had no choice. She had come this far. There was no way out but through. With a deep breath, she opened the book. At first, there was nothing. No words, no images, no revelations. Just empty pages, one after another, stretching into the distance, each blank page an endless void that seemed to mock her. But then, as her eyes moved across the page, the first words began to appear, slowly at first, as if they were being written in real time, appearing out of thin air. The house remembers. The words seemed to echo in the room, reverberating off the walls, a soft whisper that filled the space. Iris blinked, unsure of what she was seeing. She turned the page, and more words followed, each one appearing like a pulse, each one pulling her deeper into the mystery. The words flowed like water, each sentence building upon the last, weaving a story that was both foreign and familiar. It waits. Iris felt the weight of the house's gaze upon her, the pulse of its energy growing stronger, more insistent. She could feel the house now, not just in her bones, but in her soul, its ancient presence weaving itself into the fabric of her being. The house was not just a place. It was a memory, a consciousness, a spirit trapped in time. And now, Iris was part of it. The house is you. You are the house. The words seemed to burn into her mind, searing themselves into her consciousness. She felt the truth of it, deep within her. like a hidden pulse that had always been there but had been waiting for the right moment to awaken. She had been searching for the answers, but all along, the answers had been within her. She was not just a visitor in this house. She was its keeper, its heir, its final breath. The air around her seemed to grow thick with emotion, the whispers of the house rising to a crescendo. Iris could hear the voices now, clearer than ever before, not just the echoes of the past, but the voices of those who had been lost, who had been forgotten, who had once lived within these walls. They were not trapped, they were waiting for her to understand, to see what had always been there. The book continued to write itself, the pages turning faster now, the words more urgent, as if they were finally reaching the climax of a story that had been left unfinished for far too long. The house cannot die. The truth struck her like a bolt of lightning, and for a moment, she was suspended in time, caught between the past and the present, between the living and the dead. The house was alive, but it was also dying. It was caught in an endless cycle, trapped in the memories of those who had once lived here, of the souls who had given everything to the house, only to be swallowed by it. But it was not just the house that could not die. It was her, too. Iris could feel it now, the bond between them, the thread that connected her to the house. She had come here searching for answers, but now she realized that she was not meant to find them. She was meant to become them. She was the keeper, the one who would carry the house's story into eternity. As the last page of the book turned, the final words appeared in front of her. The house remembers, and so do you. The air seemed to pulse with finality, and the light in the room flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out like fingers, reaching for her. Iris closed the book, feeling the weight of its history settle in her hands. The whispers had faded now, leaving behind only silence, the kind of silence that held all the answers but no words to express them. She looked around the room, the walls now still, the house finally at rest. The energy that had once vibrated through the space had dissipated, leaving a profound emptiness in its wake. But there was no fear. There was only peace. Iris understood now. The house would never truly die. It was a part of her, just as she was a part of it. The house had waited for her, just as she had waited for it. And now, she was its keeper, its final breath. With a quiet sigh, Iris placed the book back on the pedestal, its story complete. She turned and walked out of the room, the house silent behind her, the shadows fading into the distance. As she crossed the threshold, she looked back one last time, and the house, alive, eternal, looked back at her. And then, she stepped into the world beyond.